Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to continue looking at the use of override filters inside of the Calculate Revisor, right? With the slight added twist that we're going to show what happens when you're using multiple overrides. And as a hint, it's basically the same thing. So really what we're doing is we're continuing our previous look at the use of override filters and adding just a little bit of a twist to it to really cement those ideas in your head. That way, when you're out there in the wild writing your own code, hopefully you'll be able to visualize what's happening, right? Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? I'm here in Filter Revisors Part 1.xlsx, and I'm in the Calc Override B tab. And here we have a similar problem to what we had before, right, where we're going to use the calculate function to go run some sub-expression with revised filters. But here we have not one, but two override filters, right? So calculate has three arguments. The first argument is always the sub-expression. Arguments 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1,000. 99% of the time are these override filters. There's a couple other advanced things you could do with them, but almost always, especially when you're starting out, it's going to be these override filters, which is what we've got right here, where we've got this bit of code, which is going to generate a temp table for one override filter, and this bit of code right here, which will generate a temp table for a second override filter. This override filter will be for pasta. This override filter will be for lunch. So business-wise, what are we doing? We want to get the total number of units sold for lunch pasta dishes. Okay, so here's how that's going to work somewhat mechanically. Right? When we start off, the first thing we see is the calculate function. The calculate function is a revisor, which means it's going to revise the filters, then run a sub-expression. So when we see a revisor, and calculates a revisor, we want to get really good at finding the sub-expression and with our eyes freezing it to remind ourselves that it's going to be the last thing that runs, right? Even though this bit of code right here comes before this and comes before this is actually going to be the very last thing that runs because it's a sub-expression. It's only going to run after these guys have been run and added as filters. So to remind ourselves that this gets run last, let's go ahead and freeze it with our eyeballs. And in fact, with our eyeballs, I'm going to use Microsoft Excel to do it. So I'm going to right-click on those cells right there. I'm going to go to my paint roller, and I'm going to freeze it. Brr, cold. Okay, so that is argument 1 of calculate. Calculates sub-expression. It only gets run after the filters have been revised. It only gets unfrozen and run after the filters have been revised. Okay. So how are we going to revise the filters? Well, I do see these two override filters there, but before we do override filters, there's this question of current row filtering that we at least have to check in on, right? So when you revise the filters, you're going to perform current row filtering, adding any current row values as filters, also known as context transition. And then when you're done with that, you'll add override filters. So we have to ask the question, are there any current row values to add as filters? Well, the only way that there would be current row values is if we were using this revisor calculator here as part of an expression column definition. So if there was like a sum x or a min x or a max x or an average x up here, and calculate was a part of that expression column definition for that iterator, we would have some values of the current row to add as filters. Because we don't, there's actually no values of the current row to add. Therefore, we're done, right? We say, well, we're not using this revisor as part of an expression column definition, so we've successfully added all the values of the current rows filters because there weren't any to add. Okay, check mark, done with that. So now we say, all right, what about override filters? Are there any override filters for this revisor? Well, yeah, sure there are. Here's calculate right there. Argument 1 is always a sub-expression. All the additional arguments, right, are going to be override filters. So we've got 1 right there, and we've got 1 right there. So what do we have to do? We need to evaluate that, and we need to evaluate that. That'll produce some temp tables. Calculate will then take those temp tables and add them as override filters to our filter context. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do this top one first. Specifically, it actually doesn't matter if we do this one first or that one first. But, you know, just in the spirit of going from top to bottom, we'll go ahead and do this argument number 2 here before we do argument number 3. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, we're going to perform this derivation, go get all the visible rows of the dish column, pass it into the filter iterator, which will add this column to it, and just keep the true results. So what are all the different dishes? Well, we're going to use the all derivation right there, which is going to ignore any filters in the filter context. But there's no filters in the filter context, so it ends up not mattering. Regardless, what are all the dishes, right? Well, let's see. There's dishes right there. There's pasta, burger, and salad. You should probably have that memorized by now. I certainly do. So I come down here. I'm going to type in dish. I'm going to type in pasta, burger, and salad. Okay. So that derivation right there on line 9 produces this temp table right here. But this is not the finished version. We just want that pasta row right there. So what do? We pass it into the filter iterator, which is going to add an expression column with this definition to it and just keep the true results. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in EXP. I've already done all the hard work here. So as soon as I hit enter, we're going to see that I've already got the formula pre-populated. For each row, check to see if that row's dish is equal to pasta. Is that equal to pasta? True, it certainly is. Pasta does equal pasta. Does burger equal pasta? No, it does not. False. Does salad equal pasta? No, it does not. False. So what does the filter function do? Takes this temp table and the expression called right there, and it just keeps the true rows. So this will produce a temp table that looks like this. Dish equals pasta. Dish equals pasta. This bit of code right there is a way of producing a temp table that looks like that. Okay. Now this is our first override, but we're not going to add it yet because what we want to do is we want to evaluate all of these before we add them as filters, right? The reason we're going to do that is because you might think that when I evaluate argument 3, it gets evaluated with a filter for pasta in place. It does not. This filter for pasta only gets added after all the other ones have been created. They all get added kind of at once, right? So the filters here, when I say the order doesn't matter, that's why it doesn't matter, right? So this one right here, it is not going to work with a filter for pasta in place. We create all the temp tables, and then calculate adds them all at once as override filters. Okay, so we're kind of press pause on that right there. We've got the temp table ready, and we're going to add it in a second, but not just yet. Before we add it, let's go ahead and evaluate all the other things that are going to be override filters, which is argument 3 right there. So here we're going to go get all the different shifts. We're going to use that derivation right there to go get all the shifts, regardless of the filters in the filter context. Well, what are the different shifts? Well, there's lunch and dinner still. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in shift, lunch, dinner, right? And we're going to add an expression column where we just keep the lunch row. So I type in EXP, EXP. I go ahead, hit enter, right? For each row, check to see if that row's shift is equal to lunch. We get a true right there. Lunch equals lunch. Dinner does not equal lunch, so we get a false. What does the filter iterator do? It just keeps the true rows, so we get shift equals lunch. So I come over here. I'm going to type in shift, lunch, and I hit enter. Okay, good. So now we're done evaluating all our additional arguments, right? Calculate can then take both of these temp tables and add them as our override filters since they've all been evaluated. It evaluates them first, then it adds them all at once. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to click on there. I'm going to left click and drag, and I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy. It's more realistic to say that it moves it, but I like seeing it in both places, so I hold down Control to make a copy, right? So now I'm going to select these and also add this to the filter context. Left click, drag, hold down Control, and let go, right? So now Calculate took both of these temp tables and added them as override filters. Once they're in the filter context, it doesn't matter where they came from, if they came from a current row or they came from an override. But either way, these two are from overrides, right? And so we've got dish equals pasta and shift equals lunch. Okay, so there were no current row values to add. We went ahead and evaluated all of the additional arguments that were going to be override filters and then added them to turn them into override filters, right? So we're done revising the filters context. We've created a revised filter context. That's what this is right there. So since we've got that revised filter context, Calculate says, gosh, I'm so happy right now. I've been waiting for ages and ages to unfreeze this sub expression and run it. And now that we've got the revised filter context, I can do exactly that. So Calculate's going to pop this sub expression in the microwave to unfreeze it. Pop it in the microwave for 30 seconds. Unfreeze it. And this will be the very last thing that runs, right? Even though it's argument 1, arguments 2 and 3 run first. This is the last thing that runs, okay? So when it runs, what does it do? Well, we say, let's go get all the visible rows of mini. We'll pass it into the SumX iterator, which is going to add an expression column with that definition to it and sum up the results, right? Oh, but wait, I actually forgot the bit where I filter it down, right? So if this is the filter context for dish equals pasta and shift equals lunch, we shouldn't be looking at all these rows. We should just be looking at pasta and lunch. Let's filter down to pasta. And let's filter down to lunch. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is what gets evaluated into this filter context, which means the model looks like this. The mini table looks like this. So we get all the visible rows of mini. Let's go ahead and select those right there. Control-C to copy. Come down here. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values to go execute that derivation. There we go. We've got all the visible rows of mini. Now we pass that into the sum iterator, which adds an expression column with that definition, sums up the results. So I come over here, I type in exp. Right, I've already got the hard work done, so we get the units for each and every row. So I get 2 and we get 1, and we add up the results because it's the sumx function. So I come over here, type in equals sum, and go sum these up, closing parentheses, and hit enter. And the result is 3. 3 is the number of pasta lunch units that we sold, right? So 3 is what the calculate function actually returns, right? But we're not quite done, right? Calculate is a good roommate, which means it cleans up after itself, just like all revisers, just like measures, right? So it's going to clean up after itself, and by that I mean it's going to set the filter context back to the way that it found it, right? It made these changes to run the sub expression. It's done running it. It got the number it wanted. It can now set those filters back. So I'm going to come over here, Control-C to copy that little swatch of orange. I'm going to select those cells right there, Control-V to paste, and good. Now Calculate has set the filters back. I can go ahead and clear that. And I can clear that. There we go. And we're done. Okay. Very mechanical, very easy. Okay. So, well, said me, I've been doing this a long time. It's easy once you get the hang of it, right? The pattern itself is pretty simple. You just kind of have to see it a bunch of times. Speaking of seeing it a bunch of times, let's do this again, right? So this time we're also going to add 2 filters. We're going to add 1 filter for dish equals burger and 1 filter for shift equals dinner. Okay, so what are we going to get? We're going to get the total units for burger dinner sales. Okay, that's the business question that we're trying to answer. So what's going to happen mechanically? Well, when we go to run this code, the very first thing that it sees is this revisor. So when you have a revisor, the first thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that you, with your eyeballs, freeze the sub expression to remind yourself that this is the last thing that runs. Even though this right here is argument run, it's going to argument 1. It's going to run after arguments 2 and 3. So we have to freeze it with our eyeballs to remind ourselves of that. So I'm going to right click on this, head up to the paint roller. I'm going to pick this blue color right there, cold. Okay, so argument 1 of calculate, which is our sub expression, the sub expression for calculate, we've frozen with our eyeballs to remind ourselves that this is the last thing that runs. Now we could go ahead and revise the filters, because once we revise the filters, we can unfreeze this and run it. Okay, so how are we going to revise the filters? Well, it's a 2-step process, right? So there's step 1A and step 1B. So I guess it's an A-B step process. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to perform current row filtering, adding any current row values as filters, also known as context transition. However, this only is meaningful if we use the revisor as part of an iterator's expression column. So if this calculate was being used as part of argument 2 of sum x or min x or average x or something like that, which we will see in a future example, then there would be values of a current row to add. But since we're not using that, right, there's no values of a current row, therefore we're done. We said, are there any values of the current row to add? No, there aren't any. So we're done with current row filtering, right? No values to add. Cool, check that off the list, all done. Calculate then says, like any good revisor, okay, I'm done performing current row filtering. There were no current row values to add. I now have to add any override filters. Are there any override filters? Yep. Argument 2 and argument 3 right there. Okay, so what do we have to do? We have to evaluate these bits of code right there in the original filter context to go get the temp tables that Calculate will add as override filters. So let's do that. So here for argument 2, right, we're going to go derive all the values of dish, right? So let's see. That was a bit confusing. For this one right there, we're going to go get all the values of dish, add this column to it, and just keep the true results. So what are the values of dish? Well, there's pasta, burger, and salad. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in dish, pasta, burger, and salad. A good trio. And we're going to take that derivation, which corresponds to that bit of code right there. We're going to pass it into the filter iterator, which is going to add that expression column to it and just keep the true results. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in exp. I've already done the hard work, where for every single row, we check to see if that row's dish equals burger. Pasta does not equal burger, we get a false. Burger does equal burger, we get a true. Salad does not equal burger, as much as I would like it to, and we get a false. So what do we keep? The filter iterator is just going to keep the true rows. Filter iterator. So we're just going to keep dish equals burger. There we go. Okay. Now, we're not going to add this yet because we have to finish evaluating all of our other overrides. We're going to add them all at once. You might think to yourself that when I go to evaluate this bit of code right here, it's going to happen with a filter for burger in place, but that's not true. The only thing that's going to be affected by the new filter is the sub expression. All this other stuff out here, I should say all this other stuff out there is going to be evaluated in the original filter context with no filters. Okay, so speaking of which, we've done argument 2. Let's go do argument 3 right there. Go get all the values of shift regardless of filters. We're going to use the all derivation, right? Pass it into the filter iterator where we add that column to it. Go check to see if each row shift equals dinner and just keep the true results. That'll produce the temp table, which is our override filter. So let's make that happen. So let's go up here. Notice the filter context is empty, as it usually is in our sort of default state right here. In our examples, I should say. So we want to go get all the shifts. Well, there's lunch and dinner, so I'm going to come down here. I'm going to type in shift. I'm going to do lunch, and I'm going to do dinner. There we go, right? And that's the derivation, the result of that right there, all the different values of shift, which we pass into the filter iterator, which adds that expression column to it and keeps the true rows. So I come over here, type in exp. I hit enter, right? And I've already got the hard work done. So for each row, we check to see if the shift, that row shift is equal to dinner. Does lunch equal dinner? Nope, false. Does dinner equal dinner? Yes, it absolutely does. True, right? So what does the filter iterator do with this expression column? It just keeps the true rows, which means it just keeps that row right there. So what do we end up with? We end up with a temp table that looks like this. Shift equals dinner, okay? So now we've evaluated all of these additional arguments, and they are temp tables there. And there we can then, and by we I mean the calculate function can then take these temp tables and add them as override filters. So it's going to take that one right there, left click. It's more accurate to say that I move it, but I like to make a copy, so I'm going to hold down Control. I get the little plus symbol next to my arrow. I let go to make a copy of it, right? And I'm going to add this one as well. And by I mean the calculate function. And by move it, I mean that's assuming I could use my mouse correctly. Sorry, my trackball is getting a little dirty these days. There we go. I move that. Left click and drag. Hold down Control to make a copy. More accurate to say that I move it, but I like to see it in both places. Okay, so we've got our temp tables there, which are just these moved into the filter context, right? And so now we finished adding current row values as filters, current row filter. We did that a while ago. There were no values to add. We said, are there any override filters? Well, there were a bunch of expressions out here, so we went ahead and evaluated them all to get some temp tables, and then calculate said, okay, those are my override filters, and we just added them to add our override filters. Now we're done revising the filter context. This here is our new revised filter context that we're going to run our sub expression in. So let's filter down to burger and dinner. So I'm going to click on burger. And I'm also going to filter down to dinner. That one lonely diner. That one person who got the hamburger. Okay, good. So we're just looking at burger and dinner. Calculate says I'm done revising the filters. I've got a new revised filter context. I can now unfreeze my sub expression and run it. This will be the last thing that runs. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to go pop that in the microwave for 30 seconds. Stick the blow dryer at it. Point the blow dryer at it. I'm going to sort of unfreeze it there. Okay, good. Now we can run this under our new revised filter context. So go get all the visible rows of many. Pass it to the sum x iterator, which will add an expression column with that definition to it. Get the units for each row. And sum up the results. You should be very familiar with that bit. So I'm going to go select those right there. Kind of hard to select because there's not very many of them. I'm going to come over here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values, click OK. There we go. I've derived all the visible rows of many. I pass it to the sum x iterator, which adds that expression column to it, sums up the results. Come over here. I'm going to type in EXP. All the hard work is already done. So for each row, I get the units. So I get 2 right there, and now I'm going to sum up the results because this is the sum x function. So I'm going to type in equals sum. And the sum of that number and nothing else. Who's good at math? I go ahead and enter, I get the number 2, which is the total number of, boy, he bought 2 burgers, huh? So this one person bought 2 burgers, right? That's the number of burgers that were bought in the dinner shift, okay? Now, that's what the calculate function returns is that number 2 right there, scalar technically, is that number 2 right there. It's the result of running all this code, but we're not quite done yet. Calculate is a good roommate, like all revisers, which means, like all reviser, it cleans up after itself. So, in order to run this sub expression, it created a revised filter context by adding these filters, but now it's going to set them back to the way that it found it and be a good, polite roommate. So I'm going to click on that little swatch orange, Control-C to copy, select those right there, Control-V to paste, Good. Now the calculate function has set the filters back to the way it found it. Let's remove these filters up here. There we go. And do this one as well. There we go. And we are all done. We get that number 2 right there. Okay. One more example. And oh my goodness, I saved the best for last, maybe, kind of. In fact, I kind of had to move things around to get it to all fit. Here, we're going to use the calculate revisor, just like before. And now we have not 1, not 2, but 3 override filters. 1 for lunch, 1 for to-go, 1 for burger. It's the same process, just now we're going to do 3 of these guys. Okay, so what are we going to get here? Business-wise, we're going to calculate the total number of units for lunch, to-go, burger orders. Okay. So in order to do that, we have to use the calculate revisor to say, I want to go run this, but I want to add a filter for lunch, I want to add a filter for to-go, and I want to add a filter for burgers. And we're going to use these snippets of code to add those filters, to create the temp tables, which calculate will then add as filters, to be somewhat specific. Okay, so mechanically what's going to happen? Okay, so here on line 1, we say, what's the first thing we see? We see this calculate revisor, which means if it's a revisor, there has to be a sub-expression, because the sub-expression is the thing that will get run under revised filters. So let's go find that sub-expression, right? Now, I've conveniently added little comments here to tell you where it is. You're going to have to remember, with calculate, it's always going to be argument 1. So when you are writing your own code and you write argument 1 of calculate, I want you to, with your eyeballs, to freeze it, right? You can make the background blue with your eyeballs if you want to, or I should say your imagination. Don't stare at it like and concentrate. It won't actually work. Use your imagination to make the background of the text is blue color, like that. Nope, like that right there, right? Use your imagination to make the background of the text blue, or make the actual letters blue. However you want to do it, you need to remind yourself that the sub-expression of calculate is going to be the very last thing that runs. So we're going to use the metaphor of freezing it to remind ourselves that it's the last thing that runs. Even though this bit of code comes before this bit, and this bit, it's going to run after all this other stuff happens, because it's the sub-expression, which is why we froze it. Okay, you get the idea. All right, so we froze our sub-expression. Calculate can now go about the business of revising the filters to get the filters just right for running the sub-expression, right? So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to say, I need to start by performing current row filtering, adding any current row values as filters, also known as context transition. So this would only make sense if we were using the revisor as part of an iterator's expression column. So if this calculate was part of the expression column for a sum x or a min x or a max x, well then, that means it would be part of an expression column, which means it happens on a row-by-row basis. So we would have to find all the values of current row, right, for each and every cell and add them as filters, but it's not. So there are no values to the current row, so there's nothing to add. We'll see examples of that pretty soon, but for right now, because this isn't being called as part of an iterator's expression column, there's no current row values to add. Okay, good. That means we're done adding current row values because there weren't any to add, because we didn't run this as part of an expression column. Okay. So we're done adding current row values. Now we have to say, are there any override filters? Oh gosh, there's so many this time. Well, you know, a couple anyways. There's 1, 2, 3. Any argument past that first argument, right? In all intermediate cases, there's always going to be an override filter. There's some advanced places where you could do some trickier stuff, but for purposes of learning DAX, you should just think of any expression, or I should say any argument beyond the first argument, which is the sub-expression. Any additional argument is always going to be an override filter. That's the way to learn it, right? Okay, good. So we've got 1, 2, 3. We need to evaluate this argument, this argument, and this argument, turn them into temp tables there, and there. Once they're temp tables, calculate can add them all at once to the filter context. So let's do these one by one. Let's start with argument 2 right there. Let's go get all the values of shift, passed into the filter iterator, which will add this column to it to keep the true rows. So what are all the values of shift? We should know this by now. Even if you're jumping into this video in the middle of the series, shift equals lunch. There's only the 2 values. Lunch and dinner, right? Not diner, dinner. Okay. So there's all the values of shift. That's that derivation right there. We pass it into the filter iterator, which adds an expression column which says for each row, check to see if that row's shift is equal to lunch. So I come over here, I type in exp, I hit enter. I've already done all the hard work. Does lunch equal lunch? It does. So we get a true. Does dinner equal lunch? It does not. So we get a false. So what does the filter iterator do? It creates a temp table with just the true rows, specifically shift equals lunch. There we go. Okay. So that is argument 2 right there. Now, you might think we add the override right now. We don't. We have to evaluate all of these at once, and then we add them all at the same time. That's important because you might think that when I go to evaluate this bit of code right there, I do so with the filter for lunch in place, and that's not true. The only thing that's going to be affected by any of these filters is the sub expression, which is why it actually doesn't matter what order you put these override arguments in. Right? Okay, good. So what are we going to do? We're going to go get this derivation right here where we get all the different types. We're going to pass it into the filter iterator where we add a column where we say, for each row, check to see if the type is equal to go, and we're just going to keep the true rows. Okay, so let's do that. So I'm going to come over here. What are the different types? Well, we've got to go, and we've got dine in, right? And now that derivation right there is going to get passed into the filter iterator. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in exp. I hit enter. All the hard work is already done. We check to see if each row's type is equal to go. To go equals to go, so we get a true. Dine in does not equal to go, so we get a false. And what does the filter iterator do? It's just going to keep the true rows. That one right there, right? So we go over here. I'm going to type in type, and I'm going to do to go. Sorry, dine in. Okay, so type equals to go. Okay, good. So that's the third argument right there, which is the second override. Gosh, it can be kind of hard to keep track of. Now let's do the this third override, which is, for what it's worth, argument 4. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to go get all the values of dish, pass it into the filter iterator, where we're going to add a column, an expression column, where we check to see if each row's dish is equal, or each row's, boy, I mistyped that. Let me fix that real quick. Each row's not pasta. Each row's dish is equal to burger, right? And then we're just going to keep the true rows. Okay, so what are all the dishes? Well, there's pasta, burger, and salad, right? So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in dish, pasta, burger, and salad, right? And we're going to add this expression column to it where we check each row's dish, not each row's pasta, each row's dish, and check to see if it's equal to burger. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in exp. I've already done all the hard work, right? Does pasta equal burger? False. It does not. Does burger equal burger? It does. True. How about salad? Does salad equal burger? As much as I wish that it did, it does not. And so we get yet another false. What does the filter iterator do? It just keeps the true rows, which is that one row right there, right? And so this is going to produce a temp table, return a temp table that looks like this. Dish equals burger. There we go. Okay. So we've evaluated argument 2. We've evaluated argument 3. We've evaluated argument 4. We've gotten our temp tables there, and there. And now Calculate says, okay, I could take all these temp tables and add them to the filter context one by one. The order here doesn't actually matter. So I'm going to click and drag, hold down Control to make a copy of it. More realistic to say that you move it, but I like seeing it in both places. So I make a copy of it. I'm going to select that one right there and move it. Hold down Control to make a copy of it, right? And I'm going to add this one right here. Left click and drag, hold down Control to make a copy of it. Okay. So the calculate function took the temp tables there, there, and there, and added them to the filter context, right? Now let's review, right? We checked to see if there were any values of the current row, and there weren't any, so we didn't have to perform any current row filtering, or we did, and there was nothing to do, right? We checked to see if there were any override filters. Oh, yeah, there were several. We went ahead and evaluated all those arguments to produce temp tables, which we then added to the filter context. By we, I mean the calculate function, the calculate reviser. So we're done revising the filter context. This is our new revised filter context. After all that, this is the revised filter context that we're going to run that sub expression in. So let's go ahead and filter down. Let's filter down to lunch. Let's filter down to type equals to go. And let's finally filter down to burger. Dish equals burger. There we go. Sorry, pasta. Okay, good. So now that we've got this new revised filter context, Calculate, after all that, can unfreeze the sub expression and run it. So even though it's the first argument, it's the last thing that runs. So I'm going to left click. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to pop this in the microwave for 30 seconds, point the hairdryer at it, and melt it. There we go. We've unfrozen it. Gosh, it feels good to be unfrozen. Okay, so now Calculate can now run this sub expression in this filter context right here. Go get all the visible rows of mini, pass it to the subx iterator, which will add that column to it, and sum up the results. So I'm going to select that right there. Control-C to copy. Come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on Values, or hit the V key, and hit OK. Good. So now we've done that derivation right there to get all the visible rows of mini, which is just the lunch to go burger rows, right? Now we pass it to the sum iterator, which adds that expression column to it and sums up the results. Pop over here, type in exp. When I hit enter, I've already done the hard work. So for each row, we get the rows units. So I get 1 and I get 3. And what are we going to do with the results? Well, this is the sumx function, so it's going to sum them up. So I'm going to type equals sum. I'm going to go right there, add closing parentheses, and I hit enter. There we go. And I get the number 4, which is, by the way, what the calculate function returns, which is, by the way, the number of units for lunch to go burger orders. We're not done, though. We're very close, but we're not quite done, right? The calculate function, the calculate revisor, right, created a revised filter context to run this sub expression, but it's a good roommate. And like all good roommates, it cleans up after itself. So after creating this revised filter context, it's going to set it back to the way it found it, right? What a nice thing to do. Okay, so I'm going to click on this little swatch of orange, Control-C to copy, and I'm going to select there, Control-V to paste, right? Good. Now calculate is done, cleaning up the mess that it made. The filters are back to the way that the calculate revisor found it, just like all revisors do. Let's go ahead and set these guys back. There we go. And oops, I guess they're all burgers. Let's see, let's clear that one. Oh, I guess there was a clear button that I could have hit. I don't use Excel quite as often as I used to. Okay, there we go. All right, good. So that is the result, which gets that number 4 right there. Now, what I want to point out right before we call it a day here is in the last several examples, both in this video and the last, the expression column for the filters that we've been adding, right, using the filter function, are hard-coded text, right? So shift equals lunch in quotation marks. Type equals to go in quotation marks. Dish equals burger in quotation marks. By in quotation marks, I mean that text string, that text string, that text string. So because these are hard-coded values, this is what we refer to as a static override pattern. Override because these are override filters. Static because the actual filters themselves won't change regardless of what cell you run this in, right? So it doesn't matter how you run it, what slicers are in place, what row of a summary table this is in. You're always going to get the exact same overrides because it just says equal and then a hard-coded text string. In the future, we're going to show you how to use some, not all that fancy DAX, it's stuff you've actually already used before, to make these kind of overrides dynamic, right? So it can detect what the current filters are and say, based on the current ones, we should show lunch or we should show dinner. Or based on the current slicers or the current row, we should show to go or we should show dine in. Something like that. That will be an example of, those will be examples of dynamic overrides. But for now, static overrides are kind of the way to start this off, right? I point this out because the static overrides is one of our patterns, right, in elements of DAX. Now, I don't need you to memorize that. I just want to point out that we're learning the patterns as we go, right? So by the time we get to the pattern section, a lot of it is going to seem like review because it's stuff we've already done. It's just ways of using the fundamental principles of how DAX works and giving it a name, right? Which is sort of what we're doing here with the static override pattern. Okay, so again, don't worry about remembering the names of these patterns just yet. Just wanted to point out that we are learning these things as we go. So I think you've got a very good sense of how to use override filters using the calculate revisors. Practice makes perfect, but I think you can start to visualize this in your head. I sure do hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.